I didn't know that a single sentence could change the temperature of a room forever. But it did, and it happened on an ordinary afternoon when nothing dramatic was supposed to occur, the kind of day that slips past unnoticed unless it decides to wound you. I was folding towels at the kitchen counter, the soft cotton warm from the dryer, my hands moving automatically the way they had for decades, when I heard my name drift through the house, not spoken, but weighed, measured, handled like an inconvenience that needed to be dealt with quietly. Their voices were low, careful, the way people speak when they believe kindness is optional and secrecy is protection. And I knew instantly they didn't expect me to be listening, because people never imagine the ones they overlook are still fully present. There was a pause, then a sigh, then the words landed with a dull finality that didn't echo but settled, heavy and cold, right in my chest. And in that moment I understood something terrifyingly clear. They weren't angry with me, they were done with me. I stood there holding a towel that suddenly felt heavier than it should, thinking about how strange it is that the body reacts before the mind has time to catch up. How your shoulders stiffen, your breath shortens, your heartbeat steadies instead of racing, as if some deeper part of you already knows that panic won't help here, only attention will. I didn't rush in, I didn't interrupt. I didn't announce myself like I used to when I still believed explanations could save you. I stayed still, because I wanted to hear all of it, not the version softened later, not the apology that would eventually come wrapped in excuses, but the truth as it existed when they thought no one was watching. And the truth was simple in the ugliest way. I was no longer a person to them, I was a problem that needed solving. It's funny how quickly your mind starts cataloging evidence when denial falls away. How memories line up neatly as if they've been waiting for permission to speak. The sighs when I entered a room, the way conversations stopped when I sat down, the casual reminders of cost and space and stress that always seemed to follow me like a shadow I pretended not to see. I had told myself it was normal, that families get tired, that everyone is stretched thin, that love doesn't always sound gentle, and for a long time that story worked because I needed it to. But standing there, listening to my usefulness debated in my own home, I realized I had been mistaking tolerance for affection and silence for peace. I stepped into the doorway then, not to accuse, not to cry, but simply because I was done pretending I wasn't there, and the look on their faces confirmed everything. The shock, the guilt, the way words suddenly tangled when they realized the thing they'd been discussing had a voice after all. I said very little because when people show you who they are in private, there's no need to interrogate them in public. And I returned to the counter, folded the last towel carefully, and placed it on the stack as if finishing a task mattered, as if routine could anchor something that had just come loose inside me. That night at dinner, the house felt different, thinner somehow, like the walls had shifted inward. And when my hand trembled and the bowl slipped, the reaction was immediate and sharp, not concern but irritation, not help but judgment. And in that instant I saw the future laid out plainly. This wasn't a bad day, this was the direction things were moving. What hurt wasn't the noise or the embarrassment or even the sting, it was the absence of defense. The way the people I had protected my entire life chose stillness when I needed them to move, chose comfort when courage was required. And I understood then that loyalty given without limits teaches others how little they have to give back. Later, sitting alone with the quiet pressing in from every side, I asked myself a question I should have asked years earlier but never dared to because the answer felt too dangerous. When did helping become expected, and when did expected turn into resented? I thought about all the times I had made myself smaller to keep things running smoothly, all the ways I had absorbed discomfort so others wouldn't have to, and I realized how easily love can be mistaken for obligation when you never ask for acknowledgement. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was restless, but because my mind was suddenly alert in a new way, replaying moments not to torture me, but to inform me, to show me a pattern I could no longer afford to ignore. There is a particular clarity that comes when you stop asking why and start asking what now. And as the house settled into its familiar nighttime sounds, I felt something steady take root beneath the hurt. Not anger, not revenge, but awareness. The quiet understanding that if people can discuss your worth without you in the room, they have already decided how little it matters. I didn't know yet what I would do with that knowledge, only that I would not waste it. Because something in me had finally shifted from enduring to observing, from hoping to preparing, and while they slept believing the problem remained contained, I lay awake realizing that this was not the end of my usefulness. It was the beginning of my accounting, and once you start keeping score, not out of bitterness but out of truth, everything changes. Have you ever noticed how help slowly stops being appreciated and starts being audited? How one day you're thanked for showing up and the next day your presence is tallied like a cost no one agreed to pay? Because that was the shift I began to feel after the words I overheard settled into me and refused to leave. Nothing dramatic happened at first, and that's how these things always grow dangerous. Not with explosions, but with quiet recalculations, with glances exchanged over your head, with conversations that move around you as if your furniture someone forgot to dust. I kept doing what I had always done because routine is a powerful anesthetic, and because part of me still believed consistency could earn safety. So mornings began before sunrise, lunches packed without being asked, small hands guided into jackets, shoes tied, tears wiped, and every task performed with the efficiency of someone who knows the rhythm of a household better than the people who own it. But the tone changed, and tone is everything. It's the difference between thank you and finally, between can you help and why isn't this done, and once you hear it, you can't unhear it. I started noticing how requests weren't framed as requests anymore, just assumptions dropped into the air like obligations I was expected to catch. How my name was used less and less until instructions floated toward me without needing to land on anyone specific, because everyone knew who would pick them up. When I suggested something, it was brushed aside gently but firmly, the way you dismiss a child's idea without wanting to sound cruel. And when I stayed quiet instead, no one noticed, which hurt more than being corrected because invisibility always cuts deeper than disagreement. It's strange how people will rely on you completely while insisting you contribute nothing. How the hands that hold everything together are the first to be accused of doing too little. And I watched this contradiction play out daily as meals appeared. Errands were handled, messes disappeared, and yet the narrative quietly rewrote itself until I was somehow in the way of the very systems I maintained. There were comments, not sharp enough to argue with but pointed enough to bruise, remarks about costs and space and time that floated casually into conversation as if they were observations rather than accusations. And I learned quickly that defending yourself against something said lightly makes you look heavy. So I swallowed it, told myself I was imagining things, told myself everyone was tired, told myself love doesn't always sound warm. But love, I was learning, also doesn't keep score while pretending not to, and I could feel myself being weighed in small moments that added up fast. The pause before someone answered me, the sigh when I entered a room, the way plans were discussed as if I were optional until my labor was required, at which point my absence would suddenly become a crisis. I kept telling myself that families go through seasons, that usefulness shifts, that my role was simply changing, but deep down I knew the truth was harsher and simpler. I wasn't transitioning into something new, I was being slowly erased from something I had built. What made it worse wasn't the workload, because work has never frightened me. It was the way help became expected but never credited, how reliability turns into entitlement when you give without boundaries, and how people grow irritated not when you fail them, but when you remind them how much they rely on you. I noticed how quickly discomfort followed any attempt I made to step back, even slightly, how a single missed task caused more reaction than years of consistency ever earned praise. And that's when it hit me that appreciation wasn't coming later, it had already passed, unnoticed. And I was standing in its shadow pretending it might return. The hardest part wasn't what was said to me, but what was said around me. Conversations about stress and pressure that always circled back to my existence, as if I were an added weight instead of the reason things functioned at all. And I realized how convenient it is to blame the person who absorbs everything quietly because they rarely fight back. I watched the way silence protected others at my expense, how my restraint became their permission, and how the more I tried to smooth things over, the rougher I was treated, as if kindness without limits signals that you can take a little more. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who need you but don't see you. from being essential and expendable at the same time. And it does something to your sense of self if you let it linger too long. Makes you question whether you're actually contributing or just occupying space no one wants to acknowledge. I found myself rehearsing explanations no one had asked for, justifying my presence internally as if I were preparing for a trial that hadn't officially begun but felt inevitable. And that's when I knew I was in trouble, because the moment you start defending your worth silently, someone else has already decided you don't have any. Nights became quieter, heavier, and I lay awake thinking about how easily care turns into control when gratitude disappears. How the line between helping and being used is invisible until you cross it. And how often people convince themselves they're being patient when they're actually being tolerated. I wasn't angry yet, and that surprised me, because anger at least gives you energy. But what I felt instead was clarity slowly sharpening into focus. The understanding that nothing I did would change how I was being framed because the story had already been written without my input. And once you realize you're not a character but a cost in someone else's narrative, you have a choice to make. You can keep performing in a role that diminishes you, or you can stop, even if stopping means everything changes. I didn't make that choice yet, not out loud, not in action. But internally something had shifted from proving to observing, from fixing to noticing. And I began quietly tracking not what I gave, but how it was received, not to shame anyone, but to tell myself the truth I had avoided for too long. Because when help becomes expected, it stops being valued. And when it stops being valued, it's only a matter of time before the person providing it is labeled the problem. And as I lay there listening to the house settle around me, I understood something that would soon change everything. The more invisible you become, the easier it is for others to forget who's holding the weight, and I had just started to realize how much I was carrying. I didn't know it yet, but the moment they stopped noticing my help was the moment I started noticing the numbers. And once you see the numbers, you can't pretend you don't. Did you ever give something away believing love would remember the cost even if you never asked it to? Because that was the quiet promise I made to myself the day I let go of the only house that had ever truly been mine. A decision I framed as generosity but now understand was faith placed in the wrong hands. I didn't wake up one morning planning to erase my own foundation. It happened gradually, the way all life-altering sacrifices do, dressed up as necessity, urgency, family, and future, words that feel noble enough to silence doubt. That house wasn't impressive by anyone else's standards, but it held the weight of my life with a steadiness I had trusted for decades. Every creaking step and stubborn pipe a familiar companion, every mark on the wall a quiet witness to who I had been and how hard I had worked to stay standing. I raised a child there, mourned a husband there, learned how to survive loneliness there, and when I think back now, I realize the house wasn't just shelter. It was proof that I had built something lasting with my own hands and endurance. When they came to me talking about space and schools and opportunity, their voices full of hope and pressure intertwined, I didn't hear a request, I heard responsibility calling my name, the kind mother's answer without checking the balance first. They spoke of timelines and shortfalls, of how close they were to something better if only one final piece could fall into place. And I filled in that gap without hesitation because that's what I had always done, step in quietly so the next generation could stand taller. I told myself paperwork didn't matter, that love didn't need documentation, that I wasn't buying ownership, just helping secure stability. And it felt good in that moment to be needed in a way that sounded permanent rather than convenient. I didn't ask to be listed anywhere, didn't insist on acknowledgement, didn't pause long enough to imagine a future where memory would be selective and gratitude would expire. Because imagining that would have meant doubting people I wanted to believe in. Letting go of that house felt like closing a chapter with dignity at the time, like passing the torch forward. And I remember standing in the empty living room one last time, listening to the echo of my footsteps, telling myself that roots can be replanted anywhere, that home is people, not walls. What I didn't consider was how quickly walls forget who paid for them once the ink dries and life moves on. Moving into their place was supposed to be temporary, just until things settled, just until routines formed, just until everyone adjusted. but temporary has a way of stretching when it benefits everyone except the one waiting. The space I was given shrank without anyone ever saying it out loud, not because rooms physically moved, but because my presence was treated as something that needed to fit around others rather than belong alongside them. I told myself closeness was worth the discomfort, that being near grandchildren, being useful, being available was a fair trade for privacy and quiet. And for a while I believed it because I wanted to. I watched the days fill with responsibilities that felt familiar enough to soothe me: school mornings, meals, laundry, small crises that needed calming hands. And I convinced myself that this was the new shape of my life, smaller maybe, but still meaningful. But meaning without respect is a fragile thing, and it cracks slowly, first in moments you brush off, then in patterns you can't ignore. I started to notice how easily my sacrifice was folded into the background, how the story of that house shifted from something I gave to something they earned, how history was quietly edited until my contribution sounded less like a foundation and more like a footnote. No one was cruel about it at first, and that's what made it so effective, because cruelty invites resistance, while indifference invites self-doubt. I found myself minimizing what I had done even in my own mind, downplaying it as help rather than investment, as support rather than sacrifice, because acknowledging the truth would have required asking why it no longer mattered. The house I gave up became an unspoken agreement I was never allowed to reference, and every time I felt the urge to remind them, I swallowed it, afraid that mentioning it would make me seem calculating, as if remembering your own generosity is somehow a flaw. That fear kept me quiet longer than I should have been, and silence once again did its quiet damage. There's a particular irony in watching people relax into comfort built on your loss while slowly treating you like excess, and I lived inside that contradiction daily, surrounded by things made easier by what I had given up, while being reminded in subtle ways that ease has limits and I was approaching them. I began to understand how generosity without boundaries doesn't inspire gratitude. It inspires expectation, and expectation, once unmet, turns into resentment, no matter how unfair that may be. Looking back now, I see that the moment I handed over that house without conditions was the moment I taught them I would always make myself smaller to keep others comfortable. And once people learn that lesson, they rarely forget it. I didn't regret helping then, and I don't regret loving now, but regret is a complicated thing. And part of it lives in realizing that I trusted people to remember what I never allowed myself to say out loud. As the days passed and the house I once owned became a memory I carried alone, I felt something shift inside me, a growing awareness that sacrifice only has meaning when it's honored, and when it's not, it quietly turns into something else entirely. I wasn't angry yet, but I was no longer naive, and that difference mattered more than I understood at the time. Because once you recognize that your generosity has been reclassified as entitlement, you can no longer pretend you're simply helping. You're sustaining something that no longer sustains you back. And as I lay awake one night thinking about that empty living room and the life I had handed forward without receipt or recognition, a thought settled in that refused to leave. If they no longer remembered what I gave, then I would have to remember it for myself, because the truth has a way of demanding acknowledgement eventually, and I was starting to feel that day drawing closer. I told myself the house was gone and the chapter closed, but I hadn't yet realized that what I gave away was still quietly holding everything up, and soon that truth would come with a price. What moment tells you the truth without asking your permission to hear it? Because for me it wasn't loud or dramatic or planned, it was small enough to almost miss, which is how you know it matters. The kind of moment that doesn't announce itself but rearranges everything afterward. It happened during dinner on an evening that should have been forgettable. The table set the same way it always was. Familiar food, familiar seats, familiar tension pretending to be normal. And I remember thinking how strange it is that routine can survive almost anything, even respect quietly draining out of a room. My hands were aching that night, the dull throb I'd learned to work through without comment, because pain that doesn't inconvenience others rarely earns sympathy. And as I reached forward, the bowl slipped, not dramatically, just enough for hot liquid to spill and spread. And in that split second before anyone spoke, I felt the old instinct rise in me, the reflex to apologize quickly, to fix it faster than anyone could be annoyed, to disappear from the inconvenience I'd caused. The reaction came before I could finish moving, sharp and immediate, not concern but irritation, not help but accusation. And the words weren't even the worst part, because words can be explained away later, reframed, softened, but tone doesn't lie. And the tone told me everything I needed to know about how my presence was being measured. I remember reaching instinctively to clean it up, to undo the problem I'd created, and being stopped, not gently, not with care, but with impatience that carried something else underneath it, something colder. And in that moment the room went very still, not because anyone was shocked, but because no one felt responsible for what had just crossed a line. I looked up, not expecting an apology, not expecting comfort, but expecting something, anything, a word, a movement, a signal that I was still protected in this space. And what met me instead was silence, the kind that isn't neutral but chosen, the kind that sides quietly with whoever speaks the loudest. That silence did more damage than the outburst ever could because it confirmed what I had been avoiding for weeks. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a hierarchy, and I was at the bottom of it. I felt something inside me go very calm then, not numb, not detached, but clear, the way you feel when you finally stop arguing with reality. And I understood that waiting for defense from someone who benefits from your silence is like waiting for shade from a tree you've already cut down. It wasn't just about that moment, or the mess, or the pain in my hands. It was about the pattern that moment completed, the evidence it sealed, because patterns don't lie, they just repeat until you acknowledge them. I realized that night that endurance had become my only contribution they recognized. That as long as I absorbed discomfort quietly, everything functioned smoothly, and the moment my humanity disrupted that flow, it was treated as an inconvenience rather than a concern. There's a particular humiliation in realizing you are valued more for what you prevent than for who you are, more for the silence you keep than the love you offer. And I sat there feeling smaller than I had in years, not because I was weak, but because I had allowed myself to be placed somewhere without objecting. I thought about how many times I had smoothed over tension before it reached others, how often I had swallowed words to keep peace, how quickly I had stepped aside so someone else could feel comfortable, and I saw then how all of that had taught them a dangerous lesson, that I would always adjust no matter the cost. The moment passed, the table was cleaned, conversation resumed in fragments, but something had shifted permanently, not in the house, but in me, because once respect crosses a line, it doesn't wander back on its own, and pretending it didn't happen only guarantees it will happen again. Later that night, alone with the quiet I used to find comforting, I replayed the scene not with anger, but with curiosity, asking myself why I had accepted so much for so long, why I had mistaken patience for strength, why I had believed love required self-erasure. The answers weren't flattering, but they were honest. And honesty, even when it hurts, is a kind of relief, because it gives you something solid to stand on. I saw clearly then that my silence had been misinterpreted not as grace, but as permission, and that people who benefit from your quiet will rarely volunteer to change it. That realization didn't make me bitter, it made me careful. And careful is powerful when you've been generous for too long without return. I didn't confront anyone that night, not because I was afraid, but because confrontation would have been premature, an emotional reaction to a situation that required something else entirely, something steadier, something that didn't ask for validation. I went to bed knowing something was over, not the relationship, not yet, but the version of me that believed enduring disrespect was part of loving well, and that knowledge settled into me with a strange sense of calm. Because when you finally accept that someone will not protect you, you stop waiting for it, and when you stop waiting, you start planning, and planning changes everything. As I lay there listening to the familiar sounds of a house I no longer felt safe inside, I understood that this was the moment my role shifted from absorber to observer, from participant to witness, and that shift mattered more than anyone else realized. They thought the incident was finished, that discomfort had been managed and order restored, but they were wrong, because what had ended wasn't the conversation, it was my tolerance. And once tolerance runs out, what replaces it isn't anger, it's resolve. I didn't raise my voice or make demands that night, but something far more dangerous had begun. I stopped enduring and I started deciding. What if the very thing they accused you of never contributing was the only reason everything stayed upright? Because that question began to circle my thoughts after that night, quiet but persistent, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Once you stop enduring and start observing, patterns sharpen, and I began to see how stability in that house didn't just happen. It was quietly funded, managed, absorbed, and smoothed over by hands no one bothered to notice. I had always believed that love meant protecting pride, especially a child's, and so I handled certain things silently, convinced that dignity mattered more than recognition, but silence has consequences, and one of them is erasure. Bills arrive the way they always do, in plain envelopes that don't care about family dynamics or hurt feelings. And when I noticed one set aside with an urgency that didn't match the casual explanations I'd been given, I felt that familiar pull to step in, not out of fear, but out of habit. I told myself it was temporary, that everyone stumbles, that helping quietly was kinder than pointing out strain. And so I did what I had done before without announcement or expectation, smoothing the edges, closing the gaps, keeping things moving so no one else would feel the impact. The strange thing about carrying weight quietly is that people don't feel the weight at all. They just feel the relief when it's gone, and because they never felt it, they assume it was never there. I didn't mark dates on a calendar or keep receipts in a folder labeled sacrifice, because that felt transactional and I wasn't keeping score then, I was keeping peace. And peace, I believed, was worth the cost. But peace purchased at the expense of truth is fragile. And as time passed, I realized how easy it is for people to rewrite history when they were never asked to acknowledge it in the first place. The household rhythm continued smoothly. No emergencies, no visible strain, and that smoothness was taken as proof that nothing was wrong, rather than evidence that someone was quietly making sure it stayed that way. I watched the way stress was discussed around me, how finances were mentioned as a general burden, never specific, never detailed, always framed as something external pressing in, and I understood then that my contributions had been absorbed into the background, their impact erased by my discretion. There were moments I almost spoke up, almost mentioned how things were being handled, not to claim credit, but to correct a growing narrative that painted me as an expense rather than a buffer. But each time I hesitated, afraid that naming my role would sound defensive. And defense, I had learned, only feeds the idea that you're guilty of something. It's a strange position to be in, knowing the truth while watching it be slowly replaced by a more convenient version, one where stability exists without cause and burden exists without context. And I felt that dissonance settle into me like a low hum I couldn't tune out. I began to understand that money, when hidden in kindness, becomes invisible, and invisible support eventually becomes expected support, and expected support becomes something no one thanks you for because it's assumed rather than appreciated. The irony was almost unbearable. The more I protected them from discomfort, the more comfortable they became believing I caused it. I noticed how conversations about cost started to include me, subtly at first, then more openly, references to usage and consumption that ignored contribution entirely. And I realized how easy it is to count what someone takes when you've forgotten what they give. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me precise. And precision is dangerous in its own quiet way, because it replaces emotion with clarity. I started paying attention not just to what I covered, but to how it was framed afterward, to the way relief was treated as normal rather than earned. And it became clear that the gap between perception and reality had grown wide enough to swallow me whole if I let it. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being mischaracterized by people you've sacrificed for. Not because they're cruel, but because they're comfortable, and comfort rarely questions its own foundations. I saw then that my silence, once an act of love, had become the mechanism of my own dismissal, and that as long as I kept cushioning every fall, no one would ever learn what the ground felt like without me. I didn't confront anyone, didn't reveal numbers or receipts, didn't announce what I had been handling, because I was no longer interested in convincing anyone of my worth. I was interested in understanding my own position clearly enough to change it. That shift mattered because once you see that you are not a drain but a dam, holding back pressure others don't even know exists, you face a choice that can't be avoided forever. Continue holding until you break or step aside and let the truth surface on its own. I wasn't ready to step aside yet, but I was ready to stop pretending the balance was fair, and that readiness settled into me with a calm resolve that surprised me. Because when you realize you've been paying far more than money, when you understand that your quiet contributions have been funding not just a household but a story that excludes you, something fundamental changes. You stop asking to be seen and you start deciding how long you're willing to remain unseen. I hadn't said a word about what I was covering, but I had started to wonder what would happen if I stopped, and that question was about to demand an answer. What happens when you stop fixing what no one respects you for fixing? Because that was the question that finally outweighed my fear of disruption. The kind of question that doesn't shout but waits patiently until you're ready to answer it honestly. I didn't wake up angry or dramatic or eager to prove a point. I woke up calm, and calm is far more dangerous to systems built on your quiet compliance. The house moved around me like it always did, familiar routines unfolding as if nothing had changed, but something had, because for the first time I wasn't reacting, I was choosing, and choice carries a different kind of weight. I made coffee, stood by the window, and noticed how little of me existed in the room beyond what I provided. How easily the day would begin without acknowledging the person who had been cushioning its edges for so long. That clarity didn't hurt the way it once would have. It steadied me, sharpened me, made me aware that the problem wasn't that they didn't see me, it was that I had kept making it easy not to. I sat down with the phone later that morning, not rushing, not trembling, just breathing evenly as if I were calling about something ordinary. Because in a way, I was ordinary responsibility finally returned to the people who claimed it was theirs. The voice on the other end was polite, procedural, uninterested in family dynamics or feelings, and that neutrality was oddly comforting, because it meant there would be no arguments here, no minimizing, no rewriting of intent, just facts laid out clearly where no one could pretend they didn't exist. I listened as details were confirmed, numbers recited, timelines clarified, and with each sentence I felt the strange relief that comes from hearing reality spoken aloud after you've carried it silently for too long. There was no confrontation in that moment, no declaration, no dramatic pause, just a simple decision articulated cleanly and without apology. And when I ended the call, I realized my hands weren't shaking at all. It struck me then how much energy I had wasted over the years bracing for reactions that never came, how much fear I had attached to the idea of stepping back, as if the world would collapse the moment I stopped holding it up. The truth I was learning is that systems don't collapse because support is removed. They reveal themselves, and revelation is uncomfortable only for those who benefited from the illusion. I went about the rest of the day quietly, not hiding anything, not announcing anything either, because the power of this decision wasn't in how it would be received, but in the fact that it no longer required permission. I cooked dinner, set the table, moved through the house with the same steady rhythm I always had, and the normalcy of it all felt almost surreal, like standing in the calm eye of a storm no one else could yet see. There was a moment, brief but telling, when I wondered if I should explain, if clarity would soften the impact, but I dismissed it just as quickly because explanation implies negotiation, and I wasn't negotiating my dignity anymore. The hardest part of stepping back isn't the fear of fallout. It's resisting the urge to manage the consequences for others, to soften the landing, to make sure no one feels too uncomfortable. And I had to remind myself that discomfort is sometimes the only teacher left when gratitude has failed. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was correcting an imbalance that had been normalized by my silence, and that distinction mattered deeply to me because I needed to know I wasn't acting from bitterness but from truth. As evening settled in and the house filled again with voices and movement, I felt a strange sense of distance, not emotional withdrawal, but perspective. The ability to see the structure clearly now that I wasn't propping it up from the inside. I watched conversations unfold, watched assumptions continue as if nothing had shifted, and I understood then how invisible support creates false confidence, How people mistake stability for self-sufficiency when they've never had to examine the source. There was no guilt in me, no second guessing, just a steady resolve that surprised me with its simplicity. Because all I had really done was stop carrying something that was never meant to be mine alone. That night, as I prepared for bed, I felt lighter in a way that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with alignment. The feeling that your actions finally match the truth you've been avoiding. I knew there would be questions soon, confusion, maybe even anger, but those were reactions to a reality I had already accepted. And that acceptance gave me a quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. I lay down listening to the house breathe around me, aware that while everything appeared unchanged on the surface, the foundation had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. Because when you stop fixing problems no one respects you for solving, you don't create chaos. You create clarity, and clarity, once introduced, doesn't ask for permission to stay. They thought the day had ended like any other, but I knew the truth. By morning, the weight they never noticed would finally be placed back where it belonged. Have you ever realized that the strongest exit doesn't come with raised voices or slammed doors, but with quiet certainty? Because that was the kind of strength I carried with me the night I decided it was time to stop explaining myself to people who had already decided not to understand. I didn't rehearse what I would say, didn't prepare a speech meant to wound or justify, because justification still asks for approval, and approval was no longer something I was willing to seek. The house was loud in its usual ways, televisions murmuring, footsteps moving with purpose that never seemed to include me. And I remember noticing how familiar everything felt even as it no longer felt like mine. I set the table as I always had, placed the dishes carefully, moved through the motions with a steadiness that came from years of practice. And there was something almost sacred about that normalcy, because it reminded me that dignity doesn't disappear just because others fail to recognize it. When I sat down, I felt no anger, only clarity. The kind that settles after a long internal argument finally reaches its conclusion. The envelope rested near my place, unremarkable, unadorned, carrying nothing dramatic, just facts and finality. And when I placed it where it couldn't be ignored, I did so without ceremony, because ceremony would have turned this into a performance, and I was done performing. The questions came quickly, confusion first, irritation following close behind, and I answered them simply without defensiveness. Because truth doesn't need volume to be heard. I spoke about responsibility being returned, about obligations aligning with ownership, about support that had quietly ended. And as I spoke, I watched realization spread slowly, unevenly, like light reaching corners that had never been examined. There was disbelief, then disbelief dressed as offense, and finally something closer to fear, and I understood then how deeply people rely on what they pretend not to notice. I didn't list everything I had done, didn't recount sacrifices, didn't present evidence meant to shame, because that would have turned my truth into an argument, and arguments invite denial. Instead, I stated what would happen next, calmly, firmly, without apology, and I felt something settle into place inside me, a sense of alignment I hadn't known I was missing. When voices rose, I didn't match them. When accusations surfaced, I didn't defend myself. When guilt was offered like a bargaining chip, I let it fall untouched, because none of it changed the reality that had already been set in motion. I wasn't leaving to teach a lesson, I was leaving because staying had taught me one I could no longer ignore. The moment stretched, heavy with things unsaid and suddenly understood, and in that silence I realized how accustomed they had been to my presence as infrastructure rather than person, how shocking it is for people when support stops being automatic and starts being conditional. I stood up then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just decisively, and retrieved the small bag I had prepared quietly earlier, containing only what mattered, because when you finally choose yourself, you discover how little you actually need. There were protests, questions, attempts to soften the moment with promises that came too late, and I listened without absorbing, because listening doesn't require agreement and empathy doesn't require surrender. I spoke once more, not to persuade, but to close a door that had been left open too long, and when I did, my voice didn't shake, which surprised me more than anything else because it told me I was ready. I walked through the house slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the years I had spent there, touching nothing, taking nothing extra, carrying only what was mine in the truest sense. And as I reached the threshold, I paused, not to look back with regret, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was. An ending chosen, not endured. Stepping outside felt quieter than I expected, the air cooler, the world wider, and with each step away, I felt the weight lift not from my shoulders but from my chest, the place where I had stored too many unspoken compromises. I didn't know exactly where I was going yet, and for the first time, that uncertainty didn't frighten me because it was paired with something far more powerful: self-respect. As I moved forward into the dark, guided not by anger but by resolve, I understood that leaving without explanation is sometimes the clearest explanation of all. And while they stood behind me grappling with a reality they never prepared for, I walked on knowing that the story they told about me would finally have to stand on its own, without my quiet labor holding it together. I thought the hardest part was over once I walked away, but I hadn't yet discovered what it feels like to arrive somewhere you are finally welcome. What does it feel like to arrive somewhere and realize no one is measuring your worth anymore? Because that was the question answered the moment I crossed into a life where my presence wasn't something to be justified. The first thing I noticed wasn't the place itself, but the absence of tension, the way my shoulders dropped without permission, the way my breath deepened as if my body had been waiting years for confirmation that it was finally safe. There was no scrutiny here, no quiet accounting of what I used or cost or took up, just space that existed without demanding repayment, and that alone felt like luxury. I didn't announce myself or explain why I had come, because I didn't need to, and that simplicity was more healing than any apology I could have received. Days passed differently in this new rhythm, not structured around anticipation of someone else's moods, but shaped by small choices that belonged entirely to me: when to wake, what to make, where to sit, whether to speak or stay quiet without it being interpreted as withdrawal. I began to notice how often I had been bracing before, how even rest had required vigilance, and how unfamiliar peace can feel when you first encounter it, like a language you once knew but haven't spoken in years. The person I stayed with didn't ask questions that cornered me or pushed for explanations, didn't demand a timeline or a plan, just offered presence without conditions, and that alone taught me something I had forgotten. Love doesn't interrogate, it accommodates. We shared simple routines that felt almost ceremonial in their gentleness: morning light filtering through curtains, tea poured without commentary, quiet evenings that didn't require filling with noise to avoid discomfort. And with each passing day, I felt myself returning to myself in small, steady increments. There were moments when old instincts flared, when I caught myself apologizing for nothing, offering help before it was needed, shrinking my needs out of habit, and each time I noticed, I paused, reminding myself that I was no longer in a place where survival depended on usefulness. Healing, I learned, isn't dramatic, it's repetitive. It's choosing not to flinch when no one raises their voice. It's learning that silence can be peaceful rather than dangerous. I found myself sleeping more deeply than I had in years, not because I was exhausted, but because I wasn't on guard, and waking without dread felt like a small miracle I didn't question too closely for fear it might vanish. Conversations here weren't negotiations, they were exchanges, ideas shared without fear of dismissal, laughter that didn't require careful timing, and for the first time in a long while, I felt seen without being scrutinized. I noticed how my hands stopped shaking when I poured tea, how my thoughts slowed enough to settle instead of scatter, how my voice regained a steadiness that had nothing to do with restraint and everything to do with confidence. I began to remember parts of myself I had set aside, interests that didn't serve anyone else but brought me quiet joy, habits that had been labeled unnecessary, stories I had stopped telling because no one listened, and reclaiming them felt like reopening rooms in a house I had once locked to survive. There was no rush to rebuild anything here, no pressure to replace what I had lost with something impressive, just permission to exist as I was, and that permission was transformative in its simplicity. I realized then how often people confuse being needed with being valued, and how dangerous that confusion can be, because it teaches you to endure treatment that erodes you in exchange for relevance. Here, relevance wasn't earned through labor, it was assumed through presence, and that shift changed the way I saw everything that had come before. I didn't talk much about the past at first, not because it hurt too much, but because it no longer defined the present. And when it did come up, it was met with understanding rather than minimization, acknowledgement rather than defense. Time moved gently, and with it came perspective, the ability to look back without collapsing inward, to see patterns without blaming myself for them, to understand that endurance, while admirable, is not the same as belonging. I started to imagine a future that didn't revolve around repair or redemption, but around continuation, days shaped by choice rather than obligation. And that idea felt both frightening and exhilarating in equal measure. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to realize my worth, because I had finally realized it myself, and that realization didn't need validation to be real. As weeks passed, I felt stronger, not louder or harder, just rooted, like something that had finally been planted where it could grow instead of survive. I knew this peace wasn't accidental, that it was the result of a decision I had been afraid to make for too long, an understanding that gave me a quiet pride I didn't advertise. I wasn't hiding anymore, and I wasn't running either. I was simply living in a place where I was welcome, and that welcome changed everything. But just as life began to feel whole again, just as I settled into the rhythm of days that didn't require defense, something stirred on the edge of my awareness, a reminder that the past rarely releases its grip without one final attempt to be heard. I thought distance had closed that chapter for good, but just as peace took root, the past found a way to call my name. Why is it that people remember your value only after they can no longer reach it? Because that was the question echoing in my mind when the past finally found me again, not with anger or accusation, but with fear disguised as regret. I almost didn't answer at first, not out of spite, but because peace has a way of teaching you what no longer deserves immediate access to your attention, and I had learned, slowly and carefully, to protect that. When the message finally came through, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't demanding, it was uncertain, unsteady, carrying the unmistakable tone of someone standing in the ruins of something they assumed would never fall. The words were simple, strained, filled with apologies that arrived too late to change anything but early enough to ask for rescue. And in that moment, I understood something deeply unsettling. They hadn't reached out because they missed me. They reached out because the structure I had quietly supported was collapsing without my weight holding it up. I listened without interrupting, without rushing to soothe or explain, because listening is different when you no longer feel responsible for fixing what you hear, and that difference creates space for truth to surface on its own. I heard fear, confusion, even remorse, but beneath it all I heard entitlement struggling to survive without its safety net, and recognizing that didn't make me cruel, it made me clear. When the question finally came, soft but urgent, asking if I could help, asking if I could come back, asking if we could talk things through, I felt no surge of anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet sadness for the years it took for my absence to be understood more clearly than my presence ever was. I answered calmly, not rehearsed, not defensive, simply honest, and honesty, I've learned, is far more unsettling than confrontation. I reminded them gently of what had been said, of what had been allowed, of the silence that followed moments when protection was needed most, and I could hear the realization settling in as each excuse found no place to land. There were tears, there were pauses, there were attempts to rewrite the past into something more forgivable, but I didn't argue, because arguing suggests there is still something to win, and I wasn't trying to win anything anymore. I explained quietly that I had carried enough, that I had mistaken endurance for love and silence for loyalty, and that I was no longer willing to exchange my peace for proximity. The line went quiet for a long moment, and in that silence I felt something release inside me, not resentment, not grief, but responsibility, the final shedding of a burden that was never meant to be mine alone. When the call ended, there was no dramatic goodbye, no slammed door, just finality. And I realized then that closure doesn't always come from reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from refusal. Life continued after that, gently and steadily, not marked by triumph but by wholeness, Days filled with small rituals that mattered because they were chosen, mornings that began without dread, evenings that ended without regret. I spent time in sunlight without feeling rushed, laughed without checking who might be watching, and spoke without editing myself down to something more convenient. And in those ordinary moments, I felt richer than I ever had in the house I once held together with quiet sacrifice. I began to understand that dignity isn't reclaimed in a single bold act, but in consistent choices that honor yourself when no one else is asking you to. Looking back, I no longer saw my leaving as abandonment, but as correction, a necessary recalibration that allowed everyone involved to finally face the truth of what had been taken for granted. I didn't wish them harm, and I didn't celebrate their struggle because peace doesn't need an audience or a villain to feel complete. It only needs alignment. I carried forward instead, investing my energy where it was welcomed, offering my care where it was respected, and reserving my silence not as submission, but as sovereignty. If there is one thing this journey taught me, it's that being called a burden says far more about the person speaking than the one being spoken about. And that worth is not determined by how much you can endure, but by how willing you are to protect yourself when endurance becomes exploitation. To anyone who has ever been told they take up too much space, who has been made to feel like a cost rather than a contribution, I want you to hear this clearly. Your value does not disappear because others refuse to see it, and your silence is not an obligation you owe anyone. Walking away is not failure when staying requires you to shrink, and choosing yourself is not selfish when the alternative is erasure. I didn't lose a home when I left. I found one built not from obligation or guilt, but from respect and peace, and that is something no one can take from me now. I was never dead weight, I was the foundation, and when I stopped holding everything up alone, the truth finally stood on its own.